Hi, it's so great to be with all of you, both on a video and with the part of the Mythologian. So my name is Rebecca Farrar, and I am an archetypal astrologer. I have my business name on there, Wild Witch of the West. And this is particularly important because this topic, archetypes of ecstasy from witches to the muse, negative and positive transformational figures of the feminine in myth. So that's a mouthful of a title, but this topic is one that's really near and dear to my heart for several reasons. One, it's kind of talks about Erich Neumann's theories on transformational characters, which is really, I think, stunning work. And then there's also this aspect of the personal for me. And so when the intellect and the emotional get to come together, that's for me like the sweet spot where I get really excited about something. And this aspect of the witch versus the muse is something that I'm really interested in because my business name, Wild Witch of the West, is often, there's still this kind of thought of the witch as this negative archetype, which we'll see in Neumann's work is also true. And I think just collectively, that archetype hasn't really evolved, I think, as much as I thought it had. But sometimes I'll just still get calls, from people who think that I'm like casting spells on them, or I think any business on Google who has a Google page where people can call you, it's a little iffy. But so there's this real personal aspect to me of these words, witch and muse. And so whether or not you identify as a witch, which I do, but also I identify as a muse, not specifically as a muse to others, but as a muse for myself. That hopefully this topic will evoke something that is both deeply personal with the mythological, because otherwise for me, it's like, what's the point? Okay, so all that being said, I want to start with just kind of an intro to the mythology theory with Erich Neumann, and then go into specifically more of what these figures and characters mean, and then kind of bring it back into the personal. Because for me, that's really where myth comes alive, right? It's interesting and fun to talk about it, but for me, I really want to understand why it feels a certain way and where I see myself in myth. Okay, so I'm going to start with Erich Neumann and his work, once this changes. So his work has a lot to do with, I don't know what I need to make sure this is moved over to. Okay, so he's considered a prized student of Jung. I mean, whatever that means. I would say that that's probably true just based on some of the books about their correspondence and some of the relationships that they've had in conversation around each of their work. And also The Great Mother is dedicated to Jung. So Neumann wrote many books, The Origins and History of Consciousness, The Great Mother, Amor and Psyche, The Fear of the Feminine. But these two are kind of the pivotal pieces of his kind of overarching work. Another big aspect of two large aspects of Neumann, centroversion, similar to individuation. It's kind of my favorite. I prefer it actually to individuation as a theory. It's an integration of extroversion and introversion, but for me, centroversion has a really feel, and there's also a big acknowledgement from Neumann that it is really different for men and women, and his kind of feminine and female development, archetypally, but also psychologically, feels more attuned than Jung, at least to me. I don't know if that would be true. Not that I think his work is 100%. I mean, obviously, there's still a lot of work to be done to kind of bring it up to speed in both Jung and Neumann, to kind of with this next evolution of where we are in humanity. But there are aspects of Neumann. He's also Jewish, Israeli, German. There's something about his consciousness and his psyche that feels a little bit different to me that I really appreciate. So those are kind of just a little bit of basics, like for those who don't know about Neumann, and hopefully now you will be interested in reading more. The Origins and History of Consciousness and The Great Mother, huge books, but I think really worth it. Okay, so now we've brought Neumann into the conversation. So the next piece that I want to talk about is kind of Neumann's overarching sort of theory around mythology. And so the first piece of this for me is mythology obviously is an experience of, the collective and also personal unconscious. And so for Neumann, when we study the evolution of myth, is where we actually see the evolution of consciousness happening. So there's a lot of theories related to Neumann. I'd say Jean Gebser of integrality, aspects of integral theory, Ken Wilber, Jung, there's a lot of, of course, Joseph Campbell. There's a lot of these kind of theories that have similar threads, but there's something for me around the way that Neumann positions characters and aspects of archetypes that feel more resonant for me. So the first aspect of this kind of arc of myth and individual psyche is the creation myth. And so this is the goal of a creation myth, is to explain why we're here, right? The creation. So why are we here? Who are we? And in this, the ego is contained in the unconscious, which of course we see as a theme through several depth psychologists, but that there is no individuality. So there's a cosmic universality. And the Bible, especially the Genesis, has a perfect example. Of course, there are creation mythologies and stories from all over the world. But that was just kind of the first one that came to my mind today, living in the culture that we do. So the symbol of the creation myth is the Ouroboros, or the Great Mother. And, it's a snake by the tail, but the Great Mother piece is important here, because when we get to this idea of transformational figures, there's a difference between the mother archetypes and the transformational figures. They are actually not the same, which I actually really appreciate that separation. And so what Neumann also does in this theory is that with each creation and hero and transformation, it could definitely mirror an aspect of the hero's journey. But I feel like what he does with a transformation myth is it kind of is a whole new beginning, rather than the hero myth or the hero's journey that goes around in a circle. The transformation myth has more to do with it's like it almost begins with the boon, and that integration becomes a whole other world. It's almost like it does this and then it does this, and it kind of, the evolution and the involution in both aspects. So the creation myth, to me, he also lists through what happens there. And then we get to the hero myth, where the goal is action. And he talks about there's an introverted hero and there's an extroverted hero. And that is kind of what brings us to the centroversion that's next. But if the goal is action, and it's also the ego formation, the birth of the ego, the individual self coming out of the unconscious. Oedipus is an example of this, especially because the hero myth often is the slaying of a dragon, or the slaying of the parents or the parental figures. So we go from the Ouroboros, the Great Mother, the unity, to actually killing off and separating from the parents and that unity, to the transformation myth. And what differentiates these mythologies, that the goal is self-transformation. It's the integration of the ego. So his version would be called centroversion or individuation. And the example that Neumann gives is the story of Osiris going into the underworld, this purposeful death. I also think of Inanna, Sumerian, Babylonian cultures, obviously also very related to that. And that there's a treasure and a boon, like they're going there to bring something up. And with this, for me, the transformational figures fit into the transformation myth in a different way. So in the hero myth, we've got, this journey that's happening, and there's people that you meet. But the transformation myth for me is really where I could feel the relational aspects of being changed in the boon and the treasure. And that's the goal of the transformational characters, is just, for me, I believe, to show us the relational quality of transformation itself. Something that the hero doing by themselves is different from the transformation, where it kind of requires an other. And so that's, for me, the differences that I've felt. I'm not entirely sure that would be true for everyone's interpretation, but that's my That's mine. Okay. So the next piece of this is separating the elementary from the transformative. This image is kind of, it's a little overwhelming, but this is kind of the juice of the great mother. Is we have on one axis the good mother and the terrible mother. So the good mother, is birth and rebirth, and there's like Demeter and attentiveness. And then the terrible mother is, like death, dismemberment, illness, things that are considered bad. So Kali, Gorgons. So then we take this, I'd say it's like the creation aspect of a myth. And it's also more associated, you mentioned, with like Eastern culture, where there is still this very much this more dominant sense of worshiping the great mother, versus the Western consciousness and transformative characters, where it's more of an anima. So it becomes the other in a personalized way, where, obviously the projection and romanticism of romantic love that doesn't exist in the same way in Eastern cultures, which, it's a whole other story with Robert Johnson. But this polarity of looking at a positive transformational figure as inspirational, wisdom, a visionary, and then this negative figure as like madness and impotence, and that there's this aspect of, where the anima lies on that scale. But what stuck out to me when I looked at this is so much that ecstasy is the word that is highlighted in both of these. That's where they meet. And so that's kind of the next thing that I want to bring into this equation, is that we've got these positive figures, wisdom, inspiration. Neumann also mentions the fates and graces, nymphs, muses, it's the seeress, Mary, Sophia, it's the vision, right? There's this opening with this idea of the positive. And then we have the negative, like drunkenness, madness, impotence, Lilith and Circe and the witch. And, it's this, we could call it like a dark feminine, but they meet in ecstasy. And what I love about this is that there's a loss of control with each of them, right? We're kind of enchanted, we're moved in these archetypes. And so these are obviously archetypes in mythologies. We can also, of course, experience them in ourselves or with others, or reading a myth. But as a woman, someone who very much identifies as a woman, feels very identified with also an anima complex, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this distinction feels very, it does feel really separate. And so if we think about the evolution of the transformational figures, I'm hoping that this ecstasy point, this evolution point, is there no longer becomes this is bad and this is good, right? It's just like, and this is an aspect Neumann doesn't touch on a lot, but for me, it's like, yes, a negative transformational figure could also become a positive one, and a positive one that seemingly positive can also become a negative one. And so there is this fluidity between these poles, but I almost wish that my goal or my hope is that we kind of get out of that separation, that is more integrated, that doesn't take us back to the creation myth of unity. But obviously, yes, that integration phase where we're aware of the separate psyches, and we're not just participating in these archetypes without awareness. So the next piece I want to name is just ecstasy itself, and kind of reposition, what does it mean to transform through ecstasy? So Neumann, I love quotes. I hope it's really helpful for me to have a visual when I'm giving presentations. Also, I'm a visual learner, and so I think I kind of project that onto other people, but I'm hoping that seeing the quotes and this is helpful. So Neumann says, particularly ecstasy, which with its disintegration of consciousness leaves the way open for either positive or negative development of a psychic situation. And then Robert Johnson, his book Ecstatic is one of my favorites. It says, in ecstatic expression, we recognize a long forgotten part of ourselves that makes us truly alive and connects us with every living thing. So what I hear in both of these is obviously a shift of consciousness, in many ways a disintegration or a breaking open. But it's that breaking open in the expression that connects us even more. So it connects us to ourselves, hopefully connects us to others. But I'm particularly drawn to this idea of like, how do we think about transformation as an aspect of ecstasy? Um, yeah. So just kind of going to let that sit for a moment of that what the negative and the positive, what bonds them is this shift in consciousness, but specifically ecstasy, the word ecstasy being used. Very Dionysian archetypal energy, and that's kind of the go-between. All right. So the next aspect of this is I want to take this myth aspect to the personal. Obviously, we could go so much more into all the details about these theories, but I want to try to get to the juice of why these transformational figures, I think, feel so interesting to me. So one is that the myth to the personal centroversion as this way of individuating where we take this journey from being enmeshed with our parents and our family to separating in the hero myth aspect of ourselves to centroversion, where I believe we are changed by the transformational figures and also by death, which is kind of the next aspect of this. But it's deeply, to me, it's more relational. And I think that's what I love about the idea of transformational characters is on my personal mythology, it has been people that have been my greatest transformers. These are some of the quotes that Neumann uses around transformational characters. So it compels change and intensification of the personality and extreme exertion of the ego. And I think about, when I've been on that brink of something really amazing, it's like, yeah, the ego is holding on so tightly. There's a complex there, whether it be a trauma complex, an attachment complex, some other aspect of self, but it intensifies an aspect of self that then allows for the transformation. And for me, it's in those fields of discomfort where those intensifications happen, where I'm forced to kind of look at that part of myself in a new way. So transformation, we can think of this butterfly cocoon sort of an experience or a change in state. But I also like to think of transformation as the ways in which we shift. I was saying more like shifting egoic states. And that's what these figures do in myth and then also for ourselves. So I was also kind of imagining in this, if Neumann has this version of centroversion and transformation, and there's these certain anima figures that show us what that's like, I was trying to process what this would look like. And I tried to draw created an image that would be a counter for like the animus figure. But I really just, it was taking me too long to draw it out. And it feels like a whole other journey rather than like 20-minute presentation. But I'm happy if anyone has any other thoughts on this. But the way I was imagining it was these elementary figures in the creation myth. Obviously, it would be more of like the good father, the bad father. So the good father being, supportive, protective, mentoring. I think of like the idea of the Christian God actually in many ways as kind of this like good father archetype. Then we have the negative or terrible father. And the terrible father is controlling and rigid and I would almost say abusive. And the word that's coming up is also like incestual, where I don't know if any of you, maybe this is just my TikTok video feed, but for whatever reason, Netflix and these other places have been releasing a lot of based on true story films about fathers who actually trapped their daughters in like the basement, or men who were doing that. There's one story in particular where he trapped his daughter for 24 years and raped her, and they had like 7 kids together or something. And so I was really feeling how that archetype, was playing out. And I can't believe I've been talking about this in the presentation. It's just horrible, but that is the polarity that I'm thinking of. That would be kind of the version for the those of us who might, it could be heterosexual, but also just like those archetypes, what would be the corresponding archetypes to the masculine. This polarity then of positive and negative transformational figures. I was imagining the positive as, it's like the intellectual, the professor, the spiritual guru, not the one that is abusive, but the one who, inspires us into our relationship with the divine. That would be kind of more of the positive, or also like the hard worker or the strength. Similar to kind of the evolution of the animus that Jung talks about. I would see some of those more positive ones over there. And then on the negative side, I would see like the captor or the perpetrator. And I was thinking specifically of the myth Bluebeard, which has that theme very much kind of embedded in it. So I want to kind of finish this up, but I wanted to take this moment of just trying to sit with, what is this myth that we're moving towards personally, and who are these transformational figures for us in this story, in our transformation myth. So last thing I want to end with is the stability and indestructibility, the true goals of centroversion have their mythological prototype in the conquest of death. And man's defenses against its power for death is a primordial symbol of the decay and dissolution of personality. So again, this is what differentiates us in some ways, is this desire for death and rebirth, this evolutionary force that pulls us into that, being centroversion. And I was going to go through the phases of kind of the anima complex with Esther Harding, but I think that doesn't feel as relevant other than thinking more about this image of like what are the possibilities and potentials as the masculine archetype in the world, and obviously why it hasn't been as popularized or explored, because so much of the way that women are related to is through this anima and archetypal complex. So how we provide this, and maybe this is the work that I'm eager to start doing more of, is mapping out these archetypes so that we have a version to kind of look at our own psyches in a mythological way, but also in a personal way, thinking about some of my transformational figures who have been in this positive transformational realm, and definitely in the negative transformational realm, and the aspects of my own father that are both good and terrible, and that sort of evolutionary path that we can map in a different way too. So I'll just end with my contact information, my business website. I'm on Instagram. I would love to hear from you. I'm curious about your experience. I know sometimes in a group setting, it's like harder to want to ask questions, and sometimes things need to percolate, but I'm really interested in any thoughts that come up for you, whether it's like a link. I'm sure you'll probably see threads of what I was speaking to several other bodies of work, but just putting it out there that I would love to hear from you if you have thoughts, maybe your own transformational figure ideas, who's impacted you and what that looks like, where they might fit on that scale, and just kind of anything in general. So thank you so much. I'm honored and delighted to have been a part of this, and looking forward to hearing questions.